Macbeth. Other plays of the second period. Even more gloomy is the atmosphere in Macbeth 1605, where we are present not only with the physical, but also with the moral death of the hero. At the beginning of the tragedy, Macbeth is a valiant warrior. But he is hurt by vanity. Having set foot on the path of crime, he no longer has the strength to get away from him and goes forward to inevitable death. Tragic events unfold against the backdrop of a death night, in the darkness of which flashed ominous images of the three witches. Like the three parks of ancient mythology, they gain undivided power over the fate of Macbeth. Shakespeare widely used those origins of folk literature that combine natural phenomena with the events of human life. So in Julius Caesar, the murder of Caesar and the beginning of the Civil War is preceded by a thunderstorm with thunder and lightning. When the storm drops the flame, as if a civil war has begun in heaven. In Hamlet we hear about comets, bloody dew, solar and lunar eclipses. Storm in the soul of Lear corresponds to a storm in the night steppe. Even more gloomy are the ominous phenomena in Macbeth. According to the old man talking with Ross, Macbeth, Action 2. Picture 4. These phenomena are as unnatural as the perfect deed, that is, the murder of Duncan. A little owl pecks out a falcon. Duncan's horses broke free and began to devour each other. Night darkness continues in the daytime. It came, in Ross's words, the predominance of the night. According to commentators, the word bloody is used in this work especially often and runs through the whole tragedy with a red thread. Probably more often than in other plays of Shakespeare, the word tyrant also appears in Macbeth. The theme of Macbeth in many ways resembles Richard III. As there, so here before us, both sinful blood, usurper, which first reaches the goal, but then pays for his crime. As there, so here the tragedy ends with the triumph of positive forces, Henry, Malcolm, restoring harmony in the state. Richard's cruelty grows on the bloody soil of the internecine feudal warfare of Alloy and Betwerosa. The crime of Macbeth seems to continue a string of betrayals, vagaries and rebellions, with a mention of which begins the tragedy. But the subjective relationship between Macbeth and Richard has little in common. Richard has a natural fearlessness. Macbeth is only a determination that does not follow from his nature and is the result of a struggle with himself. He is prone to reckless determination precisely because he is by nature a wavering man, and the whole path of his crimes testifies to his natural weakness, since he seeks to destroy the shadow of fear that haunts him. Richard III in many ways resembles the images of Marlowe. From the very beginning of the tragedy, he is a complete villain and frankly declares his villainy. Macbeth, although he himself was the first to think about the murder of Duncan, is in the future, in a sense, a victim of the surrounding influences. A comparison of Macbeth with Richard gives a graphic representation of the way Shakespeare traversed from the image of an isolated, in itself acting person, reminiscent of the heroes of Marlowe, to her image and interaction with the surrounding world. Note that Macbeth was the easier to succumb to the temptation that he was not only a powerful feudal lord, but, according to the ancient chronicles, a relative of Duncan and, therefore, by birth, he was close to the throne. On the other hand, Duncan himself is a weak-willed and inactive ruler. In the Shakespearean tragedy, we see Duncan in the distance from the battlefield, in which he does not take direct part, entrusting the leadership of the troops to his nobles. And yet Macbeth bears the brunt of the blame. The thought of killing Duncan came first of all to him, and was not prompted by the prophecy of the witches. From Lady Macbeth's words it is clear that the conversation about the murder of Duncan was once held between them, even before the events described in the tragedy, that is, before the witches appeared. "What kind of beast made you open this idea to me?" "Then neither time nor place favors the time," Lady Macbeth tells the husband. So, the plan was born from Macbeth himself. Once he concealed this idea and did not reject it, Macbeth fell under the power, pushing him forward along the path of crimes, which he could no longer descend from, in which the fate of Macbeth is fate embodied in the dismal image of Lady Macbeth and the more gloomy and sinister images of witches. Macbeth, who made his way to the crown in a bloody way, is easier go ahead than return to THUS peace and innocence. K. Marx and F. Engels, Works, Volume. She, p. 2, p. 115. Witches in Macbeth have long attracted the attention of Shakespearean criticism. Some see in them only the old women, the prophetesses, the poor Scots, who whisper about what everyone around whispered in secret. With this interpretation, it is difficult to reconcile at least the sudden disappearance of witches, which Bansko not without reason calls bubbles of the earth. What seemed bodily, says Macbeth about witches, dissolved like breathing in the wind. According to another interpretation, witches are only hallucinations, projected secret desires of Macbeth. In this interpretation there is an unquestionable share of truth. Witches repeat only what Macbeth was thinking about. Still, the interpretation that reduces the supernatural phenomena in Macbeth to hallucinations or the projected secret desires of the characters is hardly applicable to the play written in the early 17th century. It is doubtful, for example, that the shadow of Banquo was a hallucination. Most viewers, for whom Shakespeare wrote, believed in the reality of this shadow. There is no reason to challenge the reality of the witches in Macbeth, which Shakespeare shows separately before the appearance of other persons. In the existence of witches hardly doubted more than 2 or 3 people from the audience of the Globe, including the most educated. Did Shakespeare himself believe in witches? We do not know anything about this. But Shakespeare wrote for the audience of his time. The reality of witches is essential in the overall design of the work. Macbeth, the story is not only about the disastrous and criminal vanity, and about the external influences that take possession of a man that succumbs to them, and destroy it. In this sense, we repeat, witches are the destiny of Macbeth, not without reason. The 3 Norns were called by their English romantic poet Coleridge. They are the embodiment of all moral mud, deceit, meanness, reigned in the reality surrounding Shakespeare. The bearer of the evil fate of Macbeth, in addition to the witches, is Lady Macbeth. But no matter how negative its function, Lady Macbeth herself is not just a fourth witch, as some critics have described it. In it there is a living feeling. Her passionate love for her husband is expressed in the desire to see him king by all means, since, according to her views, purple of the royal robe and royal crown are the best decoration. In the Lady Macbeth, conflicting beginnings struggle. The fulfillment of the bloody plan collides in a tragic conflict with the humanity that this powerful nature is endowed with. Encouraging her husband to commit a crime, Lady Macbeth is broken. Her first feint is, of course, not feigned, as this feint certainly betrayed her and her husband to many present. In the course of the bloody events, Lady Macbeth, exhausted, dies, while Macbeth himself still finds the strength to fight. Let us recall in conclusion a very plausible hypothesis of ancient commentators. This tragedy may have affected the bloody events that marked the last years of the Scottish royal court. The murders of Darnley, Murray, all this was still talked about in London in the era of Shakespeare. The image of Lady Macbeth, perhaps, is not far from Maria Stuart, as she pictured Shakespeare. The tragedy, Antony and Cleopatra, is rightly called the swan song of the Renaissance, which was replaced by a century of calculating practicality. In this world, where such people as Octavius inevitably triumph, the Renaissance is reborn into a refined and effeminate hedonism. The further development of the Renaissance in England, right up to the last glimpses in Milton's poetry, was already its decline. No matter how captivating colors, Antony and Cleopatra, the feeling in this tragedy ceases to be a creative force. The love of Cleopatra not only leads Antony to destruction, but also turns nothing of his brilliant qualities. With fatigue and disappointment, both from this tragic poem, and from the image of the Egyptian queen herself, she found the brightest scenic embodiment in the exquisite work of the famous artist Eleonora Duse, 1859–1924. Hedonism is a doctrine that believes in the goal of life and the highest good is pleasure. Here it is, Cleopatra Shakespeare, a woman in love, already tired of love, but powerless to cope with his last passion. Alas! I drink the sweetest poison. Is it possible that he would remember me, all black from the kisses of Phoebe, covered with wrinkles of the years? Fatigue is reflected in her face, and at that moment, when she talks about her wrinkles, her face, Duse, suddenly seems de-aged. Algorevich Elisir Duse, The Northern Herald, 1891, number 8. Only at the end of the tragedy Cleopatra acquires a natural strength. She sort of descends from the throne, turning from a queen into a simple loving woman. At the beginning of the monologue she falls down her royal clothes and crown. She calls wine the juice of Egyptian vines, compares herself to fire and air. But the tonality of epithets and metaphors is gradually changing. Cleopatra now remembers her lover as curly Antonia. Biting her breast is Pidum, by comparison, a child sucking the breast of the nurse until she falls asleep. Cleopatra is no longer a seducer, not an amazing creature, as Enobarb called it. In Coriolanus we see the catastrophe of the cult of a strong personality sung by the Renaissance, who 20 years earlier found the most optimistic expression in the Tamerlane the Great Marlowe. Tamerlane's will was a creative force. Nor is the mighty will of Coriolanus a force of destructive, turned against himself and condemning to futility his genius abilities, his fearless courage, his unpretentious hypocrisy and frankness. If the activities of Tamerlane set in motion the masses, innumerable as the sand of the sea, and if Tamerlane goes to the head of an army consisting, as he himself says, of the village boys, Coriolanus' actions are directed against the masses, against the people. Precisely because Coriolanus opposed himself to the people, he turns out to be a void. Blinded by self-love, Coriolanus raised his sword against his people, his homeland. But at a decisive moment Volumnia appeared before him. Coriolanus hears his mother's voice. He voluntarily drops the sword he brought over his homeland, although he knows that his inevitable death is waiting for him. That is why this death acquires a heroic sound, and the word noble, as the epithet of Coriolanus, is twice pronounced at the end of the tragedy. Measure for Measure 1604 is only attributed to external comedies. In fact, it is a drama full of bitter feelings and painful experiences. The action takes place nominally in Vienna. In fact, we are facing the unattractive outskirts of London at the beginning of the 17th century, a growing large city, largely a capitalist city, with its ugly variety, hypocritical judges, stupid police officers, bankrupt officers led by Lucio who dream of war as the only opportunity at least for a while to fill holes in pockets, with gallows and prisons, criminals, executioners and procureurs' images, as if anticipating Gogarth's sullen drawings, syphilis. Everything is rotten through our state, he could say in a virtuous C.S. Callan, Measure for Measure. Horrified by the rampant crime and debauchery, the Duke leaves the throne, rather disappointed in his own abilities to rule the state than seeking, like the ancient Harun al-Rashid, to observe from the outside. But even in this unhappy comedy Shakespeare condemns the desire to escape from life. Leaving the Duke from the helm almost led to the shedding of innocent blood and many disasters. Central to this work is, of course, the image of Angelo, who becomes the ruler of the state. Some critics unfairly compared him to Tartuffe. Unlike the last, Angelo is not just a rogue and a deceiver who was hypocritical deliberately. If he stayed away from life, in his seclusion, among scholars of legal books, he would probably retain his virtue. But Angelo becomes the ruler of the state and is forced to take an active part in life. After touching life, Angelo's virtue betrays him. Not without a heavy struggle with himself, as if carried away by the surging stormy chaotic stream of life, Angelo, becoming the ruler of the state, turns out to be a slave of lascivious passion. The role of Angelo has always been a grateful task for the great tragic actors. The depth of this image was admired by Pushkin. In Molière, he wrote, "The hypocrite trails after his benefactor's wife. Hypocrisy takes possession for preservation. Hypocrisy asks a glass of water. Hypocrisy." In Shakespeare, a hypocrite pronounces a judgment with vain austerity, but rightly, he justifies his cruelty with a profound judgment. A statesman, he seduces innocence with strong, fascinating sophisms, not a funny mixture of piety and red tape. Angelo, a hypocrite, because his foul actions contradict his secret passions. And what depth in this ex-character! Isabella, who Angelo pursues with his criminal passion, but Shakespeare's thoughts are deeply right, when for the sake of maintaining moral purity is ready to sacrifice even the life of a beloved brother. This is not selfishness and not hypocrisy. For Isabella, it is better to sacrifice a loved one than to commit a crime. But Isabella is wrong when, seeking salvation from the surrounding meanness and dirt, she wants to flee from life to a monastery. Life destroys her intention, and instead of vows she turns out to be the bride of the Duke. The Duke himself at the end of the play throws off his monastic robe, returns to the throne, and the finale justifies the words that the Duke says at the very beginning, and which are the leitmotif of the entire play, the words that nature does not tolerate withdrawal from life. It is a creditor requiring from the person of percent. Only in the early comedy of the second period, The End to the Cause of the Crown 1602, where Helen's love for Bertram and her enterprise conquered all obstacles, and where the Falstaff laughter sounds loudly in the wonderful scene of exposing the boastful warrior, we find the gleam of the former cheerfulness. Help often depends on ourselves, and we only ascribe it to heaven. Helen says, "The destiny giving heaven gives us the freedom to act. It only hinders us when we are slow." On the way to Helen's happiness there is a class inequality. She, the daughter of a poor doctor, is in love with the haughty, arrogant Bertram, proud of her aristocratic blood. But her selfless love eventually conquers Bertram's heart. "Forgive me," he pleads at the end of the play. The idea of natural equality of people proclaims the French king in his famous monologue. "The blood of all people," says the king, "is the same in color, weight and heat. Thanks to business, even the lowest position becomes honorable. Good is fine, no matter how you call it. Essence lies in the properties, not in the names." But let us return to the tragic theme of the second period of Shakespeare's work. This tragic theme reaches its limit in the Timon of Athens 1608. Here are heard the notes of despair. "I'm a misanthrope and I hate humanity," exclaims Timon. Contemplation of the world, in which capitalist relations took root, led Shakespeare to the edge of a pessimistic life negation. The world in his eyes became like a forest inhabited by rapacious animals, as Ape says in Timon of Athens. Timon was rich, and friends flattered him. Timon went bankrupt, and friends, dogs and wolves, call them Tim, turned away from him. Over that society, to which Timon belongs, is dominated by a single deity, gold, whose temple is more disgraceful than the pig pens. In this society, honor is given for riches, despising nature. Everything in this society is crooked. A scholar's head dives in a low bow before a mad fool. Those who rob on the highway and openly feed on people are more honorable than the respectable representatives of this society, because they do not cover their robbery with holiness. "Rob each other," says Timon, giving the thieves gold, "cut your throats. All you meet are thieves. Go to Athens, break into shops, steal from thieves, and let the cold destroy you. Amen. Rob. Timon says to the servants, "Your important gentlemen are large robbers and are robbed by law." Gripped by desperation, Timon leaves the human society and leaves on a deserted beach. In his famous monologue, he curses the corrupt power of gold over people and discusses the essence of money. Action IV. Picture 2. Shakespeare perfectly depicts the essence of money, wrote Marx about this monologue. K. Marx and F. Engels on Art. M. L. 1937, p. 67. In conclusion of this most pessimistic of Shakespeare's tragedies, we are faced with the solitary grave of Timon on a deserted seashore. The creative path of Shakespeare went, it seemed, in a circle of desperate pessimism, and yet Shakespeare found a way out of this circle in his last plays. After the first, optimistic, and second, tragic periods, Shakespeare's work entered the third period, which can be called romantic, and to which, in addition to Pericles, 1608, belong Cymbeline, 1609, Winter Fairy Tale, 1610, and the last play of Shakespeare, The Storm, 1612.